Well, hi, my name is Bey Logan, and welcome to the Cineasia DVD release of the film Young Bruce Lee, which was shot under the title Bruce Lee, My Brother. And it's actually the latest and most successful in a long line of films made by Hong Kong and Chinese filmmakers to recreate the magic of Bruce Lee. And after the passing of the late, great Little Dragon himself in the late 70s, you had loads of these Bruce-ploitation movies, Bruce Le, Bruce Lai, Bruce Leung, and then more recently a pretty ropey television series in mainland China. And this is by far the best and most lovingly presented of the bunch. Now, actually, this disclaimer, which tells you that this film was actually produced in conjunction with the side of the family that is headed by Robert Lee, Bruce's younger brother, rather than by his widow and daughter, Linda and Shannon, respectively. And here we're in what is a lovingly recreated Bruce Lee, the Lee family home, which was at 218 Nathan Road. The building's long since demolished. But I'm thinking, if I was Robert Lee, what a wonderful thing to be able to do, to go back and recreate your family home, and also recreate your family, many of whom have passed away, and have them act as you might have wished them to. I think there's a certain amount of wish fulfillment and a certain amount of nostalgic softening of the lens in this movie, but I totally understand where that would be coming from, and it probably makes for a more heartwarming film. Amazing production design by Silver Chung and props master. It's not often you mention the props master in a commentary, but if you look at the detail here in the period props, props master Zheng Chatwing, if I had a complaint about the otherwise masterful Yip Man 2, it was that it felt this movie actually was shot in the southern Chinese city of Guangzhou, which is recreating the Hong Kong of this era. But Yip Man 2 kind of looked more like Guangzhou and less like Hong Kong. Those photographs, the black and whites, they were the actual Lei Hui-chun and Grace, his wife, rather than the actors. So this is kind of recreating with a voiceover by Robert Lee himself, talking about setting us the location for where we're going to see the young Bruce Lee. This movie really, I think a lot of people were taken aback that it wasn't more of a Bruce Lee film in terms of having a storyline where Bruce Lee is a hero, goes off and learns kung fu and fights various villains. I mean, there are fight sequences, there are training sequences in the film. What the movie does, and what I think it does well, is it shows us the world that created a Bruce Lee and where he came from. And if indeed this is the first of a trilogy, I think this would be a good foundation, because you get, looking back at the stories of Bruce Lee depicted in this movie, you can see how somebody growing up under the Japanese occupation of Hong Kong, growing up under the colonial rule of Hong Kong, and having access to Western boxing and fencing and then Wing Chun Kung Fu and then American movies, how you can have a Bruce Lee. And then later, of course, I guess the story would move to Hollywood and you'd have the next stage of his development. What they do very well in this is actually to give us touchstones, things that happen now in the younger life of Bruce that pay off later. These images here are very well-crafted recreations of existing photographs of the Lee family, and you can actually see in the end credits, there's a brilliant thing they do. They actually have the actual photograph and the recreation, and it's really extraordinary the skill with which this was done. And I think one thing this movie has going for it is it's tasteful. It's a strange word to use about a kung fu movie, or a movie that's purporting to be about a Hong Kong kung fu legend, but it's done with great taste. It's beautifully shot, and I think that it's a film that when you've seen it several times, you get to enjoy the pace of it and the style of it more. You kind of have to get away from the idea of, I want to watch a Bruce Lee movie. Here's the great Tony Leung Ka-fai as Lei Hui-chun, father of Bruce Lee and a great opera star and movie actor in his own right. Leung Ka-fai, for a while he was kind of in the shadow of his namesake, Tony Leung Chiu-wai, who's just doing another Yip Man movie at the moment, Grand Masters. But he's had something of a career resurgence in the last year or so, and he's also in Detective D, which is another upcoming Cineasia release. Things you never knew. I had no idea it was snowing. I'm wondering again if this is some kind of mythologizing of Bruce Lee. It was snowing in San Francisco on November 27th, 1940. Somebody can check with the meteorological office. This is, I think, by the recollection of Robert Lee, and I would not for a moment doubt him. And there's stories here which, having been a Bruce Lee devotee for the years I have, I'm very familiar with. And there are stories that I had not heard, or aspects of the story I had not heard before. And I think this is new material that Robert has been writing about. And I think for the full time that I have been a devotee of Bruce Lee, there has been rumors that Robert Lee was going to write a book, he was going to make a documentary, he was going to make a movie, and that's like 20 years in the making. And this is the film, I guess, that encapsulates all the notes, all the ideas, all the memories he has. This is my old friend Christy Chung. I say old, I'm old, she's a friend. My old friend Christy Chung as Grace. This is all shot actually in China, hence the fact you have these very stiff Western actors, locally hired Western actors throughout, which is kind of a shame, because the foreground actors, the Chinese actors, are wonderful, but the Westerners they hire tend not to be professional actors. This whole thing about Push Lee becoming Bruce Lee, I'd never heard this before, and it's really, if it is true, it's a really charming aspect to the tale. Christy playing Eurasian in this, because Grace was actually part German, but she's actually fully Vietnamese and was raised in Canada. I heard the story that a nurse gave him the name Bruce Lee, but that was it. And there's the logo and the movie we're calling Young Bruce Lee. And little known facts, Bruce Lee's real debut was as a baby, playing a baby in the 1941 film Golden Gate Girl, directed by Quan Man-ching. This is really in the shadow of war, when the whole world is going to change. But this time, the industry in Hong Kong, the industry in China had moved into Hong Kong, and there was this thriving business. People were shooting on location in America. Even people like Quan Tak-hing, the great star of the Wong Fei-hung films, he was shooting movies like The Romancing Lovers in America. And there was actually one famous cinematographer in Hollywood, James Wong Howe, who was Chinese. So the industry really was established perhaps earlier than people realized. For most of us, Hong Kong film industry came in with Bruce Lee, with the people that followed Bruce Lee. But actually there was a thriving industry. One of the things that I personally love about this movie is that apart from the Bruce Lee aspect, it recreates that era of filmmaking. And here's, on the good ship CGI, we land this is Queen's Road, just down from my office, as it was back in the day, colorized stock footage. Before that, we saw the harbour and the waterfront, back when the harbour was twice the size it is now. The only building left from that shot before is the clock tower. Otherwise, it's all changed. And this is actually in Guangzhou, partly on old streets and partly in the studio. This is just amazing to get this tenement house and the sense of community, which, as a long-time Hong Kong resident, I have to say is sadly lacking in modern Hong Kong, where the move is everybody living in these air-conditioned bubbles high above the city. Now here's the grandmother of Bruce, played by the veteran character actress Leung. Her career goes back to the 50s and the old black and white Wong Fei-hung films, which we see depicted a little later in this movie. And she was actually working in films at the same time as Bruce Lee was a child actor and certainly knew of him, and she had met him in passing. I don't believe they worked together. She's actually most famous now to fans of this movie, All's Well Ends Well, Guy O'Hasey, which they just had the most recent one was just released here in 2011, starring my friend Donnie Yen. But she's a wonderful character actress, and you kind of need somebody strong to be like the anchor of the family for this opening sequence, and she certainly brings it. She's great at playing moms and grandmothers. And you do, all the way through the film, particularly if you're coming into this as a Western person, you get a wonderful insight into Chinese culture of this era, with many of the traditions existing to a greater or lesser degree to this day. So I think that's another aspect of the film, something you might not have got if it had been a full-on kung fu picture. And you see running to and fro the other brothers and sisters of Bruce Lee, who maybe you're not so aware of. Robert, obviously, very much intrinsic to the making of this film, his sister Phoebe, his sister Agnes, and his older brother Peter, who has also sadly since passed away. Now, the other thing that just has been decided here is that they're going to give him the name Saifeng, which is Phoenix, which is actually a girl's name. And the reason they want to give him a girl's name is because apparently earlier the couple had lost a boy child. He'd been stillborn or died very young. And so they want to give Bruce Lee a girl's name to cheat the gods. And gods obviously have very poor eyesight. And so they would actually hear this name, Saifeng, and they would actually believe that Bruce was a girl. And because boy children are more valued, I hate to be, saying that even, but that's an old Chinese tradition. The inheritance of the family name in terms of like the Confucian structure of a family, that's more important. So the boy child's more valuable to the gods, so they're less likely to steal a girl. I'm not making this up. This is the actual stuff I'm giving you here. So you see the Lee family, very well-to-do, with servants cooking for them, and very traditional. You have to say "sikfan" to everybody, "sikfan," eat rice before you can start, and it's very. Some families are still run like this to this day, and the father is like. I think they've softened considerably the depiction of Lei Hoi-chun as to how he was in real life and how he is in this movie, because I think if you actually portrayed the stern Confucian father of that era in modern terms, you're coming close to a kind of parenting that's not really acceptable, doesn't seem to be acceptable anymore. So I think he's been softened considerably, and even in the private scenes which you're about to see between him and his wife, I don't know that a stern patrician father of this era would talk to his wife about these things openly, even though he might feel them in his heart. So the wife, played by Christy Chung Lai Tai, probably, if you're a fan of action films, you'd know her most for her part opposite Jet Li in Bodyguard from Beijing, and she was also in Bride with White Hair Part 2. I think that was her very first film. She'd been like a Miss Chinatown, Miss Vietnam, basically a beauty queen who got seconded to do films in Hong Kong and became really, she had to learn Cantonese from the ground up, and indeed when she speaks it in this movie she has a pronounced accent, but she really became an interesting actress, and more so I think when you see her in the more international films she did, like the Thai film Jandara, the Tibetan language film Samsara, and they never really knew what to do with her in Hong Kong. I was lucky. I became good friends and we worked on Gen Y Cops together and The Medallion, and I used to have play dates at her home in Hong Kong with my eldest son and her daughter Jasmine. I remember that time very warmly. She relocated to Beijing with her husband, and I believe has had more kids. I haven't spoken to her for a while, and just seeing her luminous beauty in this movie makes me think I should give her a call and catch up. But she was having the last time I saw them, they were having a really happy life in Beijing. Her husband's name is John, and best to them wherever they are. But she's lovely in this film, and again, somebody I think who probably could have had better roles in Hong Kong if directors had seen something apart from the whole sex bomb thing, which is kind of limiting. Here we are backstage of the opera, and the storm of war is gathering, which must have been, I think something phenomenal to live through that. The idea that you're living on this territory that's going to be taken over by the Japanese, then taken over by the British. You don't really have a land of your own. And this is something that Bruce Lee, as a Hong Kong hero, really tapped into. That he stood up and said, I'm a Hong Kong person, I'm a hero for the Hong Kong Chinese. And in his movies, he beats the Japanese, he beats the Westerners. And the Japanese attacking with the same CGI planes they used in Yip Man, I think. So the show interrupted by the outbreak of war. I think that unfortunately with these movies, it's so expensive now to create World War II effectively. You end up using a lot of CGI ships and planes and bombs, and as you have here, a few Japanese people marching, and it's tricky to do, particularly if you have movies like Lu Chuan's film Nanjing, which depict this aspect of history so effectively to recreate it. I felt the same was true probably in Yip Man. It's kind of hard to do that on the smaller budget of this kind of film if you're not doing a big multi-million-dollar epic. So this is another Chinese tradition that you would have after the passing of somebody like the matriarch of the family. I'm looking at that the same tree from Love is a Many Splendid Thing with William Holden. If you see, there's a location very much like that in that movie. But yeah, when somebody's passed away, you put a black and white picture on the ancestor altar and then pay respects to them and hope the spirit of the ancestors gives you strength, which they're certainly going to need. Hong Kong fell almost immediately to the Japanese, and there was the most brutal repression by the invading force during the years of the war before the final liberation. And this next scene is actually based on fact. The Japanese did want to wage a propaganda war against the Chinese and kind of coerce the best-known movie actors and stage actors into performing benefit shows for this, what they were calling the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, which was the rationale that they felt that that Asia had been exploited by the foreign powers, and they would create this Asian zone, and they wanted people to go out and kind of do these propaganda tours on their behalf. Collaborator here, Ngai, is played by Wilfred Lau, Hong Kong actor, probably best known. He was in the New Option telefeature series, kind of Fei Fudoi films. This is General Wakuda, played by Shimada Yasushi, And you see there's culturally a lot of common ground between the Chinese and Japanese peoples. And it's extraordinary that there should have been the long history of conflict that there has, as he pays respect, as he comes in, instinctively pays respect. And you get this wonderful scene coming up here, the eighth aunt, Bruce Lee's eighth aunt, who is given the name Lei Hap-ngan in the movie. Her name was Lei Hap-ngan, is played by Michelle Yip, who I was aware of, I think, in supporting roles in other films or leading roles in other movies that didn't necessarily have particular merit. But this is actually the first time that I had really seen her come into her own as a character player, as a supporting player. And I think it's interesting with actors. There's Bruce Lee himself, the young Bruce Lee, 3-year-old Bruce Lee, played by Leung, who's a mainland Chinese actor. And he's like, obviously, in this sequence, you see it's very much a Fist of Fury reference, where you kind of like, if you look at Fist of Fury, there's a scene there where the collaborator, the Chinese interpreter for the Japanese, comes in. And here is Michelle Yip, who I think is terrific. She has great force and just a little supporting role. But that's what you want to do. If you get a supporting role like this, you want to come in and just really burn up the screen in the moments that you're given. I think she's terrific. She has 2 or 3 scenes in the film which are exactly what a supporting actor should do. Not try to steal the show from the leads, but you come in and just really deliver with that. Great shift of tone in the scene as you appreciate the real danger that they're in. But as I was saying, this is one of the first references in the film where you're kind of seeing this is the young Bruce Lee, and he's looking at the way the Japanese are treating the Chinese. And then later, of course, when you have Fist of Fury, and he makes the film, and you have the premiere at the Queen's Theatre, and he says, Chung mai dung beng fu, the Chinese are not the sick men of Asia. Wave upon wave of his countrymen got to their feet and cheered, because they still were old. They were still old enough they'd lived through the war, and they still had this harbored this resentment against the way towards the way they were treated by the Japanese, and quite rightly. So you had the idea here that he's witnessing this, storing it away. It's a little bit fanciful, because I think at the time they did Fist of Fury, Bruce Lee obviously was that gesture, the fist clenching. That's something that you see in Fist of Fury. But I think he would have had a lot of input. But most of the writing and directing of the film would have been the responsibility of Lo Wei for Fist of Fury. So this is a little bit fanciful, but I think the emotion that Bruce Lee brought to playing Chen Zhen in Fist of Fury, which you see here, definitely is fueled by what he had lived through. And there's a story in one of the biographies about how he would stand on the rooftop of their tenement building, wave his fist at the warplanes going overhead. We don't actually see that depicted in this movie, but that was another incident that happened in his youth. And I think those of us living in free countries can, unfortunately there are still situations like this in the world today, but those of us living in free countries can barely imagine how it must be to be under the boot of a totalitarian invading force like the Japanese. I should further mention Tony Leung, because he really hasn't been given a part of this size and complexity in an A picture for a while. We come back to this a few times. I think this is actually a kind of that little hill there looking over the runway is not something that ever really existed with that particular view, but it serves the purposes. Back on the same Queen's Road, this is like actually a set at the studios in Guangzhou, but with enhancement of the background so it goes deeper. But they're actually the structures, some of these structures do still exist, those kind of distinctive pillared buildings where you have like a little bit of covered pavement and you have the pillars. There are a few like that do, if you ever come to Hong Kong, go to Queen's Road, you'll see some buildings the same, but what they've done is actually using existing buildings in Guangzhou and also the studio backlot have extended and expanded it. There's Mama pregnant, playing mahjong, da mahjong, and she's pregnant with Robert. So that must be really interesting in a movie. Talk about your ultimate family home videos. You actually film yourself pre-birth. It's an interesting experience, it must be. There's coming up as a slight anachronism. Where are the sausages? As he's using them as this trademark weapon of Bruce Lee, the nunchaku, the seungjiquan. Actually, the movie where they use the sausages for that effect is Private Eyes, Mr. Boo, with Michael Hoy. This is kind of anachronistic because at this time, that particular weapon was only really known in the Philippines as the tabak toyak, or as an Okinawan weapon like the rice flails, the nunchaku. And they had the three-sectional stuff, the samjiquan, but the seungjiquan was really unknown in Hong Kong until the adult Bruce Lee used them in his films. And that's actually the 9-year-old Bruce Lee we saw then, played by Peng Geng. And the girl is Lei Yantung as the 8-year-old Margaret. These obviously grow up to have a mature relationship. Now, the gentleman on the left here is Leung, hugely famous Hong Kong comic actor. Well, he became so. At this point, he's asking Lei Ho-chun to give him a break. But he actually had a stamp devoted to him in the late colonial era. He was that huge of a star. Played here by Yun Tat Chung. And actually, the real Leung Sing-po was considerably heftier than the one depicted here. But was a fantastic character player. And if you ever have time to come to Hong Kong, go to the Hong Kong Film Archive. And many of the movies referenced in this film, if they're not available readily to buy on DVD, you can see them at the archive. If you go and ask, they will show it to you. My tax dollars actually being put to good use for a change. And again, this very loving and accurate recreation of a family photograph. Robert Lee, born December 16th, 1948, went on to become a very popular Hong Kong singer and was in a few films as well. I'll talk about them a bit later. So here we are back on this. This is in this street set at the Guangzhou Film Studios with where you see the wide shots, the supplemented CG background to give you more depth so that you're on Queen's Road or you're on Nathan Road going back in the distance, or on what is actually a footage of Queen's Road going off in the distance to give it some depth that you don't get just if it's the studio. And here we see, interestingly, Bruce Lee being in reality the character that he would later play in his childhood films. I'm not sure if many of you have seen those black and white movies. They've recently been re-released on DVD in various forms. I mean, in their entirety may be heavy going for people who are not die-hard fans. But it's very interesting to look at just the scenes with Bruce Lee and see the mannerisms that he took into adulthood. And also to, looking at this film, of course, you see and this is interesting, it's the first encounter between him and Unicorn Chan, Little Unicorn, Siu Geilan, who would be a lifelong friend. That's him on the ground being beaten by Bruce. And Little Unicorn went on to appear in Fist of Fury, Way of the Dragon. Bruce actually helped choreograph his starring debut, which was called Unicorn Palm or Fist of Unicorn. And I think there was some kind of rift between them towards the end of Bruce's life. And sadly, Unicorn, of course, outlived Bruce and worked on various further films, died in a car accident in Malaysia some 10 years after Bruce had passed away. So anyway, here they are as childhood friends running wild in the streets. The bright sunshine of childhood. There was another thing that they had, again, things you never knew, hanging rats in a box from telegraph poles in Hong Kong. I mean, who would know about that? I wouldn't. This is something that I'm, luckily my family, my kids do not live in a tenement like this, because this is exactly what would be going on. My eldest son actually was doing the reverse of this. Him and his mates were in detention in school and took it in turns climbing out of the window one by one to escape detention. And every time the teacher turned around from the blackboard, there's one more kid missing. Of course, I'm trying to be stern and punish him, and of course failing miserably, because I'm thinking to myself, that's such a funny scene for a movie. So this is the reverse of that. These guys have been, running around after us. Great kid that they got here, Peng Gang, to play Bruce Lee. And look at it. Look at the stern father. I am just like him. Not. Sometimes I wish my parenting skills were more sternly Confucian. I guess I'm a soft touch. So what can you do? This is nearer, I think, to what life was like in terms of the relationship between the children and their father, this very stern authoritarian. And I think that a lot of the imagined conversations between Lei Ho-chun and his wife and with the children, the gentler stuff, is perhaps a slightly, rose-tinted recollection or a recreation of how maybe Robert Lee would like his father to have been. But my feeling is that a lot more Hong Kong fathers were like this in that era, in these kind of well-to-do families. Because in Confucian structure, the father is absolutely the ruler, and first the family, then the nation. And so his word is law, and that gives structure to society. And it was very unlikely for fathers to openly express affection, very demanding. And I know families today where I would almost feel that has continued on. Thankfully not my own family. I'm no good at doing this stuff. But today you'd be in probably serious trouble if you tried to lay down the law in this manner. But certainly the kind of the spirit of it, the idea that you have this relatively antagonistic relationship between the children who, if they rebel an inch, are going to be scared out of their wits. That was more like it was in those days. So I think it's even-handed of Robert Lee in terms of him putting this film together, that he shows this aspect. Then he also, I think maybe he doesn't show how his father really acted, but he tries to show how he thinks his father felt, as he probably did. And here is another old fiend of mine, which is the comedian Chung Ming, who was one of our actors on Gen Y Cops, in a giant lobster suit. Don't ask. And he's playing Fung Fung. Fung Fung was a great character actor and directed the first the movie that made Bruce Lee a star as a child actor. And Bruce Lee was kind of played that down in later life. He didn't like to talk about those old black and white movies he was in, but he was like a Macaulay Culkin kind of guy back in the day, Chinese Macaulay Culkin. And Fung Fung fathered Fung Bo Bo, who was a well-known child actress and played Fong Se-yuk in a number of films, and also quite, in an opposite demeanor, Fung Ha-on, who was the bad guy in Jackie Chan's Police Story, and had kind of, I guess, a villainous look to his features, and so he'd always tended to play these kind of bad guy roles. Here we see the getting of the new name, because it was actually Fung Fung and his guys that came in and said that Bruce Lee has to have a new name. He couldn't be Sai Fong. He wouldn't be Lei Junfan, which was his proper Chinese family name. He would have to be Lei Xiulong, Little Dragon Lee, which of course is a name that is now legend. I mean, it's hard to imagine anybody else calling themselves the Little Dragon apart from Bruce, and that's how it came about. Here we are at the studios shooting The Kid in 1950, and this is a very accurate recreation. If you've seen this film, I think many fans of Bruce Lee would have seen clips in the Golden Harvest documentary Bruce Lee the Legend, and then later there was an American producer who very cleverly put together all these old black and white clips of Bruce Lee as a child actor, not doing kung fu, but playing kids and stuff, and released it as the real Bruce Lee. And it was the real Bruce Lee, but not necessarily the real Bruce Lee that fans in the late 70s wanted to see. And you can see there's a lot of things, the strut, the way he walks, the thumbing of the nose, all these things were kind of were created in childhood, and he carried them into his performances later, particularly in Way of the Dragon, which is very much like The Kid grown up. This is kind of like a very beat-for-beat recreation. And even though Fung Fung later in life, quite early on, had a bodybuilding injury, and his face was kind of lopsided, if that's the polite way of putting it. And they haven't tried to replicate that here, which is good. They let Dat Ming be himself. But he's a terrific on-stage comedian. Stand-up is not really a great tradition in Hong Kong, but he is definitely Hong Kong's greatest living stand-up comedian. And he did a terrific job with this film back in its day. Was groundbreaking because you show this naughty little kid full of vim and vigor. And that kid, Peng Geng, actually, who plays the young Bruce Lee, I think he has a career because he has a real charm about him, and very funny and very naughty. LaSalle College, and this is actually still, to this day, an educational institute in Hong Kong. And once again, you're seeing... Now, this is an interesting thing. You're seeing Peter fencing. Peter, played by the actor Charles Ying here. Peter Lee, the older brother of Bruce, was a fencing champion and actually represented Hong Kong in some tournaments. It's been suggested that actually Bruce adapted his kind of stop-hit technique, which he would use in his own style, Jeet Kune Do, from fencing, from his brother. He is briefly but memorably the great Anders Nelson, who was a thug in the real Bruce Lee film, Way of the Dragon. He got hit by Bruce's nunchakus, and here he's playing the headmaster of Peter and Bruce. He's actually the son of Swedish missionaries, speaks perfect Cantonese. He was in a band, Ming, back in the day. He was a pop idol, and wrote this, by the way, the performance of Bill Haley in the comics Rock Around the Clock is actually performed by MC Jin, who plays a little unicorn in the movie, which is kind of fun. Both of these 50s hits that we hear are actually performed by members of the cast, which is kind of cool. MC Jin, best known as a rapper, but here, the guy with glasses, slightly chubby guy, I hope he doesn't chase me for saying that, is Han Jin, who's a terrific local musician. He's like me, great singer, but he doesn't have... how do I put this nicely? He doesn't have movie star looks, just like myself. But he's a great guy and a great musician. Good friend of Edison Chen. I think I met Han Jin through Edison. And for the first time, we see the teenage Bruce Lee played very well by Aarif Lee. They got really lucky. I mean, Man Jun Manfred Wong, the producer and co-director of this film, he got lucky with Aarif the way that Rob Cohen did when he got Jason Scott Lee for Dragon, because, I mean, if you don't have a Bruce Lee, you really don't have a movie, and they got lucky with this kid. By the way, I don't know if you noticed, but they're actually having the hop in a martial arts school. So you see all the weapons and dummies and the lion's head on the walls, if you notice that, and this actually plays off in a moment. There was actually a lot of gangsters used to hang out in kung fu schools back in the day, and so a lot of parents really did not like their kids to be hanging out in martial arts schools. And so I meet a lot of people that they'd like to have learnt kung fu during this era, but the parents wouldn't allow it. Everybody kind of influenced by James Dean, and very American influence. And again, Bruce Lee had great reverence for American things. It's interesting, in one way he was like the Chinese are as good as anybody, and he wanted to beat up Americans in his movies, but at the same time he wanted to go back to Hollywood after he'd finished Enter the Dragon, and he wanted his kids raised in America, and he considered himself to be an American. So what you're saying, this is May, played by Emily Wong, has a little brief moment of charisma in this, and here is the referencing Elvis, Mao Wong, who's called King Cat. Mao Wong is King Cat in Chinese. This is Elvis Piggy, as he's billed in the credits. Samuel Leung, who's an actor and also a composer of some note. Everybody in Hong Kong has these... it's incredible, isn't it? 2 cast members are singing on the soundtrack. One's a rapper and one's a blues and jazz singer. And this guy the bad guy here is an actor and composer. The song 16 Tons, originally performed by Merle Travis, here performed by Han Jin. That's a great old track. I hadn't heard that for a while till I heard it in this film. But you look at Aarif sometimes. He gets like his little close-ups the first time you're really seeing him. And you go, boy, that's what a movie star looks like. I mean, you look at Bollywood films. I'm sorry, I'm not a huge fan of Bollywood movies, but their leading men look like leading men. And when was the last time you saw a leading man out of China who looked like he looks? I mean, look at him. He's got that kind of matinee idol look. You need a couple of them to have a thriving industry. And I think he acquits himself very well here, and I think he'll go on to yet greater things, and quite right too. But it's a big ask, actually, saying, hey, your first major commercial movie, play Bruce Lee. And he really came in and gave it full bore. And it's extraordinary. He is Eurasian himself, but certain angles he really carries it off well. Again, you know, these little beats that we see here that kind of pre-visualize what you're going to see in his later movies. The groin grab, which of course turns up later again in Fist of Fury. And you notice really when he comes running out in the daylight, him wearing all white here. And that's actually something you see a lot of photographs of Bruce back in the day wearing all white. Kind of funny. I knew that Bruce Lee, for all his physical prowess, could not swim or couldn't swim well, didn't like swimming. But I didn't know he couldn't ride a bike. And again, this is from Robert, so I guess it must be true. He couldn't ride a bike. All the things he could do, couldn't ride a bike, couldn't swim, and blind as a bat. I mean, Bruce Lee is the guy where, you know, if you're making excuses for why you're not something, Bruce Lee had all the excuses in the world. He had all these physical kind of limitations that he systematically overcame by a combination of his innate abilities and also his sheer work ethic. But one thing he couldn't do was ride a bike. So when was the last time you saw a hero escaping or trying to escape from a street fight riding on the back of another guy's bike? Now you watch this, a shot coming up here. I mean, I think we need to call up the animal rights people, because Hanjin's like pounding down this soundstage on his bicycle, and you watch when the chickens come in from the right. He nails a chicken. It gets up and walks away. Wham! Look at that. Get out of there, clucker. So the chicken lived for another day, but he certainly clipped it on the way past. So here we are, and this is kind of, I guess, really, again, beautifully lit. This is on the soundstage, and I guess it's kind of interesting. You're expecting, the audience is expecting a Bruce Lee fight sequence, and it's set up like it's going to be that, and it's kind of a bluff. You get the war cry for the first time, and you get the final kick Fist of Fury, a little riff from Way of the Dragon. The music from Way of the Dragon. Now, I don't know there was ever anywhere that you could see the Kai Tak runway from that angle. I used to live right near there, so unless the land was really drastically built up since the 50s, which is possible in Hong Kong, I don't know this ever existed, but it certainly makes... We come back here a few times. It's kind of funny, isn't it, the idea of Bruce Lee, who spent his whole career beating people up with barely a mark on him. You know, here you see he's been kind of busted up in the street fight. And it's kind of hijinks and the idea of him as one of the guys. Because I think when you look at Bruce in later life, he's always Sifu, he's always like the movie star, he's the master, he's the teacher. And of course he has his friends and relationships, but it always feels like it's subservient to Bruce. Here it's like it's a bunch of guys growing up, and you've got this kind of West Side Story, Days of Being Wild kind of feel to it, and it's nice to see these other sides of Bruce Lee. By the way, if you go back and look at that shot, I forgot to mention, there's something taking off from the runway, which I could not identify. Some kind of CGI fragment. I don't know if it's a bird or a plane, but go back and watch it on freeze frame. So this is obviously referencing earlier, they're sneaking back in. Han Jin's character, by the way, is the other guy climbing in, Han Jin Tan. I believe is originally from Singapore. A terrific musician, composer, guitarist, great voice. He's had a jazz album out last year, which was very creditable. He's making his acting debut here. He'd done music before for the film Princess D, but never really been in a movie before. Nominated Best Newcomer. I'm not quite sure if his work here warranted that. Best Newcomer at the Hong Kong Film Awards. But a terrific musician, and his character name is Skinny, which I'm guessing is slightly ironic. I know he might get mad when he hears this and come after me with his six string, but anyway. So the tenement and this nice shot there, and everybody eating those are called deep fried ghosts. Those breadsticks, which are very uniquely seen. There's Dada there, my friend Dada Lo, as the sister Phoebe, and Lian Ho as the other sister. And Dada is Phoebe, and Lian is Agnes, unless I've mixed them up. Dada is actually a model in Hong Kong, and what they call him, it's kind of derogatory, Lang Mo. And I'll explain that a bit later. Let's just talk about this guy. Here he is again, Wilfred Lau playing Ai, and he was a collaborator for the Japanese. Now he's the collaborator for the corrupt British police. I think it's kind of unlikely that somebody who collaborated with the Japanese would segue into a career working for the British, because you'd be hung, shot, drawn and quartered at the end of the war. Robinson, the corrupt policeman here, played by David Mersault, another locally. He's actually not bad. He's probably the best of the European actors they hired for this film. But it's a typical one-note Guilo role. Later in the film, with Bruce's nemesis, they actually try to bring a little bit of texture to it. This is accurate. I mean, I don't mind you depicting British policemen as corrupt and racist, but it's like, get good actors to do it. That's all I'm saying, is get people who, are as good as the Chinese actors are, because there are good actors around. I guess it's like in Hollywood, if you look at the way that Chinese actors are treated, it doesn't really do us any favors. But during this era, before the ICAC, the Independent Commission Against Corruption, was founded, this would happen all the time, that well-to-do Chinese families would be shaken down by the colonial police and their lackeys. And this was the part of the way of doing business. So there's quite a bit of common ground, I think, between the life that we see here and what you see in Yip Man 2. Though in Yip Man 2, really that's kind of secondary to the fact that it's a full-on martial art movie. And here, the martial arts are secondary to the fact that you have a film that's a drama, kind of a family biographical drama, showing in great detail these times, the pressures of being Chinese in these times, and kind of like, if you have somebody who's a rebel, they have to be rebelling against something. And Bruce's great idol was James Dean, who was like rebel without a cause. Well, Bruce Lee was a rebel with a cause, and his cause was the Chinese people. Because when he was a kid, he was second class because his country was owned by the Japanese. And then when he was a teenager, second class because his country was owned by the British. Here Christy speaking her Canadian accented English. She speaks like 6, 8 languages now. A phenomenal linguistics, a real cunning linguist, and very funny lady. She doesn't get to show it in this movie, but it's rare for somebody so hot to be so funny. Normally all the funny people are ugly like me, but she's a real riot. And seeing her in this, I'm going next time I go to Beijing, I'm going to hang out with her. On the next commentary, I'll let you know how it goes. So I don't know actually that Grace, even though she was Eurasian and related actually to Ho Tung, who was the first knighted of the Chinese merchants in Hong Kong, so it's Robert Ho Tung, even though she was born into that family and kind of marrying a little bit beneath herself when she married Lei Hoi Chun. I don't know that Grace spoke that good English, but maybe Robert can speak to that. And this, again, showing the dark times which I guess we're still getting blamed for, which is the British colonial era. Having said that, if you hadn't had a colonial era, would you have still had a Bruce Lee? This is a good question. And I think this film really depicts the world that created that person, and it makes Bruce Lee understandable as a on-screen figure, and also, I think, off-screen, the things that drove him, which were referenced very well also in the earlier film Dragon. I think, this is actually almost like a prequel to Dragon, and it'd be interesting to see the two films back-to-back. Lei Ho-chun quit opium as a result of the bust. I'm not sure that actually happened, but again, it's something that, in going back to tell the story, I can see why Robert Lee maybe wished his father did, or wanted to depict his father doing that. Maybe, in fact, he did. I've never read that anywhere else, apart from Robert's reminiscence. And given the nature of the times and how openly opium was smoked, and it actually had been introduced, the irony is it was introduced by the British, and here's the colonial government clamping down on it. I'm not sure that he actually did. This is Lei Ho-chun practicing Tai Chi, and you can see still images of him training with Bruce. And Bruce Lee always recognized his practice of Tai Chi with his father as being his very first exposure to the martial arts. And you can see him years later in the Pierre Berton interview playing a few Bruce Lee moves, playing a few Tai Chi moves with a Bruce Lee flavor. I'm speaking Mandarin right now. And this is Kong Jai, played by Zhang Yishan, who's also in the movie Looking for Jackie, which I think was released as something like Jackie and the Kung Fu Kid. I can't think what movie they were trying to riff on for that. But yeah, they mention here that they're going to go and see James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause, and he was definitely one of the idols, as Bruce Lee now is an idol to millions. This is Margaret, the grown-up Margaret, Angela Gong. Looks a lot like Cecilia Cheung Pachi, Nicholas Tse's wife. And I'm not the first to say that. She was in a beauty contest, and they all say she looks like Cecilia Cheung. But she really does. Kind of a thankless role here as like the other girl, or, part of a love triangle with Bruce. But yeah, they mention James Dean, and later you see a James Dean poster on the wall. And that was actually something you saw also in Dragon, the Bruce Lee story. French fries, James Dean, sky's the limit, they say. Now, I love this. Here we are in the film studios. And I kind of have my own studio now in China, and I would love it if we just had 1/5 or 1/3 of the energy and the feel of it. This is the old black and white Wong Fei-hung films being shot. How I would love to have been there, as a devotee of Hong Kong and as a fan of Hong Kong action cinema. I'd love to have seen this happening back in the days. Chin Ga-lok, he's this film's action director, the action director of young Bruce Lee. I worked with him on Dragon Squad, because he was the action director of that one as well. And he's playing Sek Gin to perfection. Sek Gin was the villain of almost all the Wong Fei-hung films, the black and white films shot in this era, like about 70, more than 70 of them. And in dozens of other films as well. Quan Tak Hing, who played Wong Fei-hung, really could only play Wong Fei-hung. But Sek Gin seemed to be in everything that was being made at this time. And of course, years later, he plays Mr. Han opposite Bruce Lee in Enter the Dragon. So we don't see Quan Tak Hing here, but we do see Leung, the actor playing Leung Fun, who's the student of Wong Fei-hung, and he's played by, in the old films, played by Cho Dat-wah. So Cho Dat-wah is being portrayed here on the left by Eddie Cheung, who's a regular in the films of Johnny To, To Ge-fong. But this is like showing behind the scenes what things were like back in the day. The director is Wu Feng, who was a very prolific director, shot many of those classic black and white Wong Fei-hung films, and I'm glad I got to meet him. He passed away some years back, but I got to meet him before then. Lion dance on the streets. Again, every cultural touchstone of this era is lovingly recreated. And how wonderful it must be for Robert to see Chinese New Year back on the screen with his family all intact and living happily under that one roof. It must be a really extraordinary feeling to be able to do that. So here you see all the detail here, the lovely fluid camera work and lighting, firecrackers, all the things that make it. It's a great family gathering. Everybody's together. So there's the young Robert, we saw him very young early on, and then slightly older now, running around as the kid. He was the youngest of the family. And there's Cho Dat-wah's wife, Mrs. Cho, Candice Yu. She plays his wife here. She just played my wife in another movie that I was a producer on called Beach Spike. Unfortunately, in that movie, I was dead. My character's dead, damn it. Hot wife like that, rich but dead. More importantly, she was in Writing Kung Fu with Bolo, directed by Bolo, who was in Enter the Dragon as well. And Ko Lo Chun, another famous man of these times, man of film of this times, played by the actor-producer Lawrence Chang. So Man Jun, the producer and co-director of the film, really pulling out all the stops to bring in, even for supporting roles, really good names, good solid character actors from the Hong Kong film industry. And I think every part here is perfectly cast. That's one thing I don't think there's any jarring note. Some people are so contemporary in their demeanour that it's very hard to take them back and do a period film with them. But to my happy surprise, even like MC Jin as Unicorn, it works. Now, they take some trouble here to see the family through the eyes of Kong, who's coming in from the poor background, the kind of the broken home, and later instigates a lot of the drama of the final act. So they're taking the trouble to show this through his eyes. To Bruce, this is all normal. To him, this is this wonderland, this big house, the family are all together, there are all these famous actors. So you get to see that, and of course it makes the tragedy of the final reel of the film all the more touching. I'm assuming if you've actually taken the trouble to listen to my commentary, you've already probably watched the film, so good for you. There's Candice is a lot of fun, and we had a lot of fun working with her on Beach Spike. She was the mother of our two voluptuous vixens, volleyball-playing vixens, Phoenix Cho and Jessica C. Here's where you see James Dean in the background. If you look carefully on the back wall, there's a poster of James Dean from Rebel Without a Cause. A lot of detail, a lot of attention to detail. You do get anachronistic things in films with the best will in the world, and this is pretty much as good as it gets. And I think, as I say, if you actually look at this film and treat it as a movie that's showing you the Hong Kong of this era, it's really extraordinary. It's an extraordinary piece of work. And it's more about the world that gave us Bruce Lee than it's a film about Bruce Lee. I mean, bear in mind, we're an hour into a Bruce Lee movie, and he really hasn't fought yet. So, if you come looking for that, then this isn't the movie for you. But if you want to see the world that created Bruce Lee, then I think it's wonderfully well represented. And you see in both upstairs and downstairs people gambling. That is actually one of the that's why Macau has risen so quickly after the end of the monopoly to be almost bigger than Vegas in terms of the revenue, because Chinese people, they love to gamble. Asian people love to gamble. Here's Fung Fung again with Fung Bo, who went on to become a hugely successful child actor, later character actor in later life, and still very much active in the industry. Her younger brother, Fung Ha-on, really got typecast playing bad guys and being an action choreographer in movies. But he's also still working. He was in Yip Man 2 as the Bagua master that fights Donnie Yen on the table. That was Fung Ha-on. I look at the guy leaning. I would. Obviously, this is a set and it's kind of safe. I hate heights. I would never sit on a balcony. I wouldn't let anybody else sit next to me on a balcony. I could not have a peaceful conversation with somebody up a balcony. Obviously, there's some stories up, and he would be seriously hurt if he fell off. I wouldn't let a guy be swinging on the balcony like that if it was me. But it's only a movie and very safe. And interestingly, many of the movies about Bruce Lee, or the Bruce Lee movies themselves, tend to be a one-man show. This is very much an ensemble piece about an extended family. Again, a recreation of an existing family photograph from this era. Now back at the studio, which is actually in the studio itself, but they've taken it, obviously, downgraded the technology that it could realistically be somewhere that you were seeing in this era. And the idea that you can go up into the bleachers and watch below the wonderful fantasies being enacted. What's extraordinary is the moments when you see it in colour, because I used to watch these things late at night on TV when I first came to Hong Kong. Here we look, Dragon Phoenix Swordsman, and again, Cho Dat-wah, played by the same guy, Cho Dat-wah, who was like in everything. I mean, he was Leung Fun in Wong Fei Hong, he was the noble swordsman, he was a detective. And this, I love seeing the live action dubbing. The lady here playing the actress Yu So Chow is Song Jia, who you might also have seen in John Woo's Red Cliff. I didn't actually know, even given that I'm a great expert on Hong Kong film, I didn't know about this until I saw this film, that they actually would have somebody in the early days of post-production, have somebody. By the way, I don't know if you recognized the guy with the Taoist outfit is actually Lawrence Chang, who was playing Mahjong earlier at the house. If you look, he's actually, you see him now in this period costume. But the idea that they would do the simultaneous, the reason they would do that is because actors didn't speak the same dialect. So if you were doing a Cantonese language, you had to have live dubbing of people speaking Cantonese. If you were a Mandarin film, you might do the same, but tended to be, by the time they got into Mandarin cinema, they would do all the the dialogue after they would shoot the films wild without sound. And then they would dub it all later at one go. And the artist, Bruce Lee, always had the same guy doing his voice in Mandarin, but it was never him. This is very romantic. It's a very romantic film. The look of it, I mean. I'm not sure that always the romantic relationships are particularly well played out or realistic, but I think the way it's shot is very much like old Hollywood, or, as I referenced before, kind of Bollywood. Like this way of introducing Pearl Cho, who was the first great unrequited love of Bruce Lee's life, here played by Jennifer Tse, who's the sister of Nicholas Tse, and the real life, the girlfriend of Andy On Chigit, who I've worked with a number of times, most recently on the big film Shanghai, who's a terrific guy. They should be compelled to have kids. They're a gorgeous couple. This is something you didn't really see referenced even in Dragon the Bruce Lee story, but the fact that he was Zatoichi, Bruce in some ways was quite vulnerable because his sight was so bad. Look how beautifully shot this is. I really can't remember the last Hong Kong movie I saw that was more beautifully filmed than this, but it's just the most luminous cinematography and really a pleasure to watch. And this dreamlike sequence we see here. But then you get this reference to the fact that Bruce Lee was extremely short-sighted, and without his glasses, he was Zatoichi level. And of course, in the Bruce Lee movies, this was never a factor. And most of the films about Bruce Lee, even Dragon the Bruce Lee story, and I think even the TV series, it was not even a factor. And here they make a little issue of it to introduce her in so they can meet cute, as they call it in Hollywood terms, talking about romantic comedies. I'm sure that's not what happened, and if it did, who would know? But so Bruce Lee smitten. And I'm fascinated. I almost think a more interesting film if Bruce Lee had not gone to America. What if he'd stayed in Hong Kong, married a Chinese actress, become a Shaw Brothers star? What would the world have been like then? What would his career have been like then? The kind of the great what-ifs. How would it have been? So this family gathering late at night, I can imagine this is, as the kid of the family, the affection and the memory. Look at the gestures here you see. This is very much Big Boss. You want to fight? I'll take you on. If you look at the Big Boss when he first finally comes out to fight, that's just how he does it. But that angle and the shadow on his face, he really looks the part. That's not a bad impersonation, actually, of the Bruce Lee autograph. And, here he is saying, well, in time to come, everybody will want my autograph. And it's right, That's exactly what came to pass. I mean, you do these auctions now, and just a signed check by Bruce Lee is selling for thousands of dollars. This is a very sweet scene, but to me, it's a kind of a very sweet kind of recreation or like a fantasy of a conversation behind closed doors that nobody would have been witness to in the house of that time. And I don't think it would happen because I think that patrician men of that generation were very, they kept this side of themselves, the romantic side, the emotional side, closed off because they just felt that was the way men had to behave. And so I don't know that this would ever or could ever have happened. But I totally understand why, when you're making a film, the way Robert Lee was creating this movie, you want to go back and you want to make your parents behave the way that you would want them to. You want your parents to be happy the way you want them to, and that's what he's doing here. And I think there's something absolutely, understandable and really quite touching about doing that, about using film to go back and not just to recreate the harshness of life in that household, in the stern Confucian household, but to bring, recreate your parents and as this loving couple. So it doesn't ring true to me in terms of the history of it, but I think in their hearts they felt this and they just never said it. And it's unfortunate because I've seen even to this day Hong Kong families where everybody's feeling love and affection and care, but they never express it. So it's, it seems a shame. People, I think, probably have a happier time if they know openly that they're cared for and loved. But anyway, this was partly and this is something you would not expect to see, this kind of thing. If you say, we're going to see a movie about Bruce Lee, this is the last thing you would expect to see. And I think it's if there's criticism of this movie, it's this kind of material. And some of it gets a little bit saccharine. But what other people didn't like about the movie are the things that I do like. Because I've seen a lot of kung fu fighting. And the kung fu fighting in this is adequate, but not particularly groundbreaking, but the depiction of old Hong Kong is really masterful. Streets of Hong Kong. This is like, I don't know how much Jennifer tipped the DP, but my goodness, she's not really quite there yet as an actress, but they really give her the launch to make her look like a leading lady. So let's hear it for cinematographer Jason Kwan. And actually, based on his work in this movie, I want to work with him. You heard it here first, folks. This is like countryside, parkland in Guangzhou. I mean, it must be a great relief to filmmakers who have to make do with the constraints of shooting in Hong Kong. Very noisy, not much space, no studios anymore. If you come to China, then you can recreate Hong Kong even more accurately than Hong Kong itself is today. And I think that's a great. It's like taking a breath of fresh air to get out of Hong Kong sometimes. And if you look at the set they built for Dark October, Bodyguards and Assassins, that was like, as far as the eye can see, it was ancient Hong Kong, and there's no way that you could actually build that in Hong Kong itself these days because the city looks so utterly different. This is a real technical college in Guangzhou where they went on location. Most of the film, and definitely most of the intricate scenes, are actually shot at the Guangzhou Film Studios, which have just moved, but the time they were doing this movie was actually in this huge kind of urban tenement building that went in all directions. Here's a Dai Pai Dong. One of the sadly, these are dying out. These street restaurants are kind of dying out in Hong Kong, which is a shame. So in this movie, you really get to see aspects of Hong Kong life that are, really vanishing around us and vanishing fast. There was another film starring Aarif Lee, which is Echoes of the Rainbow, which was shot on a film called Wing Lei Street, which was an old tenement building. And I think because of the popularity of the film, they actually, that derailed plans to demolish the buildings. And I was really glad about that. But far too much of what makes Hong Kong special has been demolished in the last few years. And it's great to have a film like this to remind us of what we've lost, and also to warn us that the city has to maintain its unique character if it's going to be a livable city as opposed to just a place that you come to make money. Now, prior to China opening itself up as a filmmaking location, if you wanted to recreate old Hong Kong, you pretty much had to go to Macau, which is what they did in Pedicab Driver with Sammo Hung, and what Wong Kar-wai did when he made In the Mood for Love. And this actually looks a lot like the Macau version of Hong Kong. This is in Guangzhou, but it's actually the Macau version of Hong Kong that you see in films where they use that with the cobblestones and the old stone buildings, because that side of Hong Kong, with a few exceptions, is pretty much gone forever. But they got throughout, I think, this choice that they've made to light this like a film from that era. Because sometimes you do see movies that are set in a bygone age, but they're lit and shot in a very contemporary way. And this, it feels like the leading man is lit like a leading man of the era that the film is set in. And definitely the lighting is very stylized and very it in a sense draws attention to itself because every shot is so beautifully realized. It definitely does have there's not one moment in the movie where you feel that it's a docudrama appeal. It's actually a movie, a biopic drama film, but shot like a movie. And I think that's one of the things that leaps out when you watch it. Is one of the most beautiful looking films seen for all time. Bruce Lee making his statement against not smoking, not taking drugs. And after my big rant just now about disappearing Hong Kong, I have to tell you that this is such a good recreation. There's a herbal actually built it like a store selling like turtle herbal teas and all these kind of the turtle jelly and sugarcane juice that's still on Hollywood Road in Hong Kong. And it looks so much like this that I was watching. When I saw the film, I was thinking, I can't remember when they shot there, because it's just around the corner from where I live. And then I realized they'd actually built it at the studio, but they'd done it so well, it really looks like the place, which I understand. I actually read the paper the other day that the building it's in might be redeveloped and it might have to close, which is a shame. But right now, as of now, if you come to Hong Kong, go to Hollywood Road, just up from the junction with Lintos Terrace, and you can find a place just like this that's been preserved, which is good. Look at the green spot. Soda. Clashing with the Westerners. Actually, both these guys are Eurasian. Charlie Owen, played by Alex Yen, no relation to Donnie. He's actually Canadian, but Canadian mixed back. Other gentleman is Roger And so they're both these kind of stoutly built hybrids. And we're about to get into our what would be the first real fight. You notice actually, if you on the Bruce Lee movies, what he did was he always had this kind of false start that he felt like he was about to fight, but he'd made a promise to his mother, he'd promised not to cause trouble, therefore he wasn't going to fight, and then finally he would cut loose. And in this film they kind of do the same thing, in that the early parts of the film constantly there's a situation when it looks like you're going to see Bruce Lee as we know and love him in action, and it never quite turns out the way that you thought. Now here's interesting. Bruce Lee at this point is not a skilled fighter, but really to be a skilled fighter, apart from training, you've got to have that reactions and you've got to have that kind of body mechanics. So what you see here, which is interesting, before he gets distracted, is look at the way the distancing. You feel that here's a guy who has a sense of the distance between him and the opponent, even though he's not fighting as yet. So that's an interesting observation on the part of Chingalok, the action director. The idea that you need some of that innate ability before you have technique on top of that. And here, because he's distracted by the arrival of the lovely Jennifer, and who wouldn't be, the way they're shooting her in this movie. So he cops a lick like that. Again, I think that the guys did the best they could, but they have this tendency of hiring non-actors to play quite... they have the same thing really on Yip Man 2, for quite front and center roles for Western actors. And it's a shame they couldn't put a bit more time and energy in finding slightly better actors so that acting is at a match with what we're seeing from the Chinese. And the guy with the glasses there on the left is MC Jin, playing Little Unicorn, who's a famous rapper in real life. Probably the most preeminent. There's like the Herbs, and there's him in terms of rap stars in Hong Kong. Now, here we are at the Gwun, and they didn't actually want to show Yip Man in great detail because we'd already had Donnie Yen playing him. He's actually played the body of Yip Man. We never see his face. He's played by Wong Chi-wai, who was actually Aarif's trainer in real life. He's a long-time cohort of Chingalok, the action director of the movie, and you can actually see him behind the scenes. They're doing boxing training. There's behind-the-scenes video of them training, and you can see the face of Yip Man, Wong Chi-wai, if you go and look at that footage. Now here's the guy playing... basically Wong Leung, who was the student of Yip Man. At that time, if you went to the martial arts school of a famous teacher like Yip Man, he himself wouldn't teach you, even if you're a famous actor like Bruce Lee, but his number one guy would. So here it's Wong Leung, and then later William Chung, Jung Cho-hing. These were the guys. And here's from the back is Wong Chi-wai, who's playing Yip Man. I guess the great Yip Man Bruce Lee movie is going to be Yip Man 3, if they get round to making that, because that would be the next stage of that story. But they made a very conscious decision that Yip Man would be a presence rather than an actual actor in the movie. Given there's the Yip Man movies, they've had a young Yip Man, Wong Kar-wai's Grandmasters is coming out. There was kind of enough Yip Men around for everybody. So this, and by the way, I think this is considerably bigger of a martial arts school than Yip Man himself would have had in Hong Kong of that era. And there's the actual shot of Bruce Lee and his real teacher and the real Yip Man. He was still the teacher of Bruce Lee. Now this, I didn't almost recognize him right away. This is actually Alex Man Chi-lang, who was a handsome, romantic leading guy back in the day, and now slightly more heavyset and a character actor, and he's playing Cho-fan, who was a famous actor, director, and a social activist of his day. And he worked with Bruce on My Son Ah Chang, which was a color movie and one of the last films that Bruce did before he left for the United States. And Cho-fan was a very feisty character, both on screen, a terrific actor, but always making films about social causes, somebody who really wanted to raise the standard of filmmaking in Hong Kong and also the standard of the working practices of the people making films there. You can actually see footage of him at the funeral of Bruce Lee. They interviewed him behind the scenes, and he obviously was one of the mourners. But he was like the last really mainstream Hong Kong filmmaker to work with Bruce before Bruce left for the States. And there's, I had not seen Alex Man. Alex Man was doing television recently, but I haven't seen him in a movie for a while, and certainly not in a part as memorable as this one. Now, Bruce, of course, as was depicted in Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, also the Cha-Cha champion of Hong Kong. And here he is kind of playing hard to get. Again, this is kind of a reference, because later when you see some of the footwork he employs, he's got the Ali shuffle happening, but also almost these kind of Cha-Cha movements. So all the things you're seeing here are like, I guess, the kind of the touchstones. It's like the Rosetta Stone, and you see this, and then you can understand why the Bruce Lee we all fell in love with back in the 70s was as he was. It was a combination of the elements of the film background, the exposure to Hollywood and James Dean and Kung Fu and Cha-Cha and all these things. Again, I can't stress enough I think the detail that you see here, the veracity with which they've recreated the era in which the movie is set, and the way people entertain themselves. And there's the lovely Dada. I actually was telling her that her name was the name of a philosophical group from Germany, the Dadaists, and I think this kind of, didn't really sink home the way I'd hoped. But we had that conversation about the Dadaists on this. I think there's a few Dadaists today in Hong Kong, but their passions go in a different direction. But she acquits herself well here, and she's good. You'll see her in Beach Bike. She's actually playing volleyball in that film, and a lot of fun. I think of those, the Leung Mo, basically, they're meant to be like fake models, or they're not real models, but she's actually probably the best of the bunch. So Cha-Cha, I don't think he would have had a dummy, a mukjong at home, and if he had, it wouldn't have been like one of these freestanding ones. It would have been in the wooden frame. The freestanding ones were back in Fatsan, where they could actually dig a hole and stick it into the ground itself. Here they were put up, the live dummy, they'd be up on the wooden frame. So this is a little bit of dramatic license. I don't think the family would have appreciated him bringing a wooden dummy and putting it on the balcony and fighting. So now you get into this kind of the romantic love triangle stuff, which, I don't know, I mean, some of it plays pretty thick for me. I think that Western audiences, probably a little of this goes a long way. But you know what amazes me is I guess I was talking to some of the production people about these bottles, and they said they found one and made plenty of the green spot bottles, because, of course, the bottles that you'd have today are different from the dimensions of those that you have back in this era. But the colours are wonderful. I mean, it's like, it feels like those old, if you look at the early photographs of this era, the colour photography, it has these same colours kind of popping out of it, and that's something that they've made a conscious decision. And it doesn't feel overproduced, but it feels that there's kind of a through line in terms of the visual style of the film, and it's something that I think is easier to try to do than to accomplish, and they do it very, very well. I can't remember the last time I've seen, apart from maybe the Wong Kar-wai movies, which is similarly designed with this detail, this care to every aspect of the production. I can't remember, definitely not the last time I saw a film devoted to an action hero, a kung fu hero, that had this degree of detail. Though I was a big fan, even though there were a lot of factual elements that didn't work with the storyline, I thought Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, the one that Rob Cohen did, actually recreated Bruce Lee in his times well, and the section that they shot in Hong Kong actually played quite well compared to the way Hong Kong is often depicted in Hollywood films, with like bamboo prisons and, dragon fights on the streets and all that kind of stuff. It kind of worked. So this film actually was, this aspect of the film got some criticism, the idea that it was the Bruce Lee love triangle. This stuff is kind of the meat of Hong Kong TV series, the melodramas you see on TVB. So I think the feeling was, if you're doing a film about the young life of Bruce Lee, you kind of want to see him doing kung fu and being Bruce Lee. The kind of the paradox there is that the Bruce Lee you see in the movies, of course, is probably late 20s, early 30s, and has had all the experiences that this young guy has yet to have. So it would really be kind of misleading if you were showing the fully realized adult Bruce Lee at this stage of his life, rather than what we're seeing here is all the different pressures and influences. And why does he leave Hong Kong when he does? Partly it's, heartbreak, the failed love affair, which, you can put whatever weight you want to on that. And also, more importantly, the fact that he's getting significantly more serious run-ins with the police, and so it's felt that he'd be better off overseas. Also, of course, having been born in San Francisco, he has a US passport, which means he's got that option. And here we are at the chart. This is a true story. When he had two girls who wanted to be his partners for this cha-cha tournament, this cha-cha competition, rather than choose one and disappoint the other, he actually trained his brother Robert to be his dancing partner, which is probably one of the oddest stories in the canon of Bruce Lee tales. But they build it up for what it's worth. But I remember reading this and seeing photographs of Bruce and Robert Lee, because there was a period after Bruce Lee died when Robert was very much in demand to do interviews, to share his stories about Bruce, and he never came out with a book or a documentary of his own, though he was often talking about it. And I think what we're seeing here is actually the product of all his long years of reminiscing and note-taking. So we see the Lee brothers, the dancing Lee brothers. And this interior actually is an old colonial building, an old European-style building in Guangzhou, and the whole film shot, for a couple of shots I'm going to mention later, which was shot in Hong Kong. But primarily, everything was either at the studio. And look at Bruce and his brother. It's so cute. And with a suit, not the glasses, but with the suit and tie, he looks just like he did when Bruce Lee auditioned for the TV pilot, Number One Son, which led him to be in Green Hornet as Kato. But you saw him in a suit and tie for that. And he really does look the part. That's what a movie star looks like. Go Aarif. He certainly had a challenging time. I mean, he's a good singer and a good actor. But for this movie, he had to learn to fight like Bruce Lee and dance like Fred Astaire. So it was quite a gig. And I think he really kind of grabbed it. And the little kid playing Robert, who definitely does look a little bit like... Robert and Bruce look nothing alike to me. And he's got like... the little kid they got to play the young Robert is very reminiscent of him. Still a little bit bizarre to see two brothers dancing like this, but it's a true story, and they're recreating it here, and it plays into the love triangle, which is resolved after the dance. And they were really... I think having access to Robert was a great... I mean, on one level, it's great because you can have somebody who says he was there and he witnessed things. The other thing is that if you have a family member as opposed to a more objective researcher or historian, obviously everything that's in the film is filtered through their recollection and the emotional weight they bring to it, which can be it can be a good or bad thing. I was surprised with Dragging the Bruce Lee story, the degree to which the Lee estate, which is his widow Linda and their daughter Shannon, had allowed to see some of the darker aspects of Bruce Lee in that movie. And even in this film, I think Robert is pretty even-handed. Most of the film really sticks pretty close to the truth or versions of the truth, and then pretty much from here on out, when we get into the last section, when he decides to fight his challenge match, when he gets involved with the triads, all of that is, I think, beyond supposition. It's just fiction. But I think they realized when they were working with Robert that if you just did a straightforward drama, that you're going to lose the audience by the end. So they had to kind of pull something out for the final reel. But from here on out, it departs, I think, from strict historical verisimilitude. And as I mentioned earlier, if you do a film about Bruce Lee, you're kind of rolling the dice because you're kind of writing something, you're developing something, and you're hoping that you're going to find an actor who's the right age and has the right physical presence and the right, demeanor, that audiences are going to believe that he is a version of this icon. And they got really lucky with Aarif Lee. Chinese name is Lei Jiteng. Aarif Rahman is his other name. He's kind of Eurasian background. And he made his acting debut in Echoes of the Rainbow, which was for Alex Law, Mabel Jung, who are good friends of mine, and it was a terrific film. Not the kind of movie that I get to make, but he did a really good job in it. And he got Best Newcomer Award at the Hong Kong Film Awards for his performance in that. Currently working on Tripitaka, which is like a Monkey King film. And it'd be interesting to see what the industry does with him after this, because... you look at Jason Scott Lee, he never really had the career that most of us anticipated after the good showing in Dragging the Bruce Lee story. So hopefully, he's got that leading man look. Hopefully the China industry will figure out stuff to do with him. This actually is one of the few scenes shot in Hong Kong. They wanted to have this particular kind of shoreline. So when you see the shoreline and throwing rocks out, that's actually in Hong Kong. Coming up now, we actually belatedly... having had the kind of the Bruce Lee the man, we now come into the beginnings of Bruce Lee the myth, Bruce Lee the hero, because it's really when people think of Bruce Lee, they're going to do a kind of a martial arts movement, running, punching, kicking, spinning weapons, and this is Bruce Lee becoming Bruce Lee. I think this is the things. Before this was the man, and now it's Bruce Lee the myth. Performing chi sao, doing the punches. All of this Aarif had to kind of do. This is kind of based on reality, that he was using poor Robert as a real training aid back at home. And there was a lot more of this footage that was shot than is seen in the film. They shot a lot of training footage of him doing his thing. Basing it on real film and photographs of Bruce Lee. And Bruce Lee must have been one of the most photographed men on the planet, because, I always like looking at photos and footage of Bruce, and there's still stuff that I see that's new to me. So he was one of the most photographed men on the planet, and he seldom took a bad picture. But that shot just then of Robert being sent flying, that kind of plays off again in Way of the Dragon when he kicks his butler off his feet. So here you see these kind of like little riffs on Bruce as he's going to be performing in the movies, doing the chain punches. Kicking wise, in this stage, it's a little anachronistic. He wouldn't be doing the chambered Korean or Japanese style kicks. There would be much more the bouncing off the ground, flipping northern style kicks. But they've taken a bit of license, I think, in terms of the choreography. So here at the school and back into the romance. And I think that's so cute, that little kind of nod of the head. That's very Bruce Lee, if you look at him on the phone in Way of the Dragon. Cinema in Hong Kong of this era was such an opiate because people were working incredibly hard. They were living normally in very small apartments. There were water shortages, power shortages, politically no freedoms. And for a really small amount of money, you could go into an air-conditioned room and you could see these gorgeous Technicolor representations of this other world. And that's why people loved cinema and why it became the potent force that it did in the popular culture of Hong Kong. Now, this is on the back lot in Guangzhou. Again, fantastic work. The details, if you look, they have like kind of weathered magazines and books and stuff from the period in the background. Guy turning up now in the rickshaw is Frankie who's always, in all the old movies, playing the same kind of... He's played Brother Hung here, the gang boss. Always plays these kind of roles in films. And he's got one of those faces. Charming man, like all of these guys, really charming in real life. But if you're casting this kind of film and you want that kind of shortcut where you see that actor and the audience immediately know he's that guy, he's the gang boss, then you hire Frankie because he just brings that. He brings not only his acting ability, but he brings the fact that the audience is so familiar with him playing all these Haksai triad roles. This supposed relationship never really works for me in the movie. I think it's meant to be unrequited, but it's a little bit too unrequited in that I never felt that she looked at him and went, gosh, look, it's Bruce Lee. And he was always kind of viewing her through these kind of soft filters of like, here she is, this angel. So this is probably the aspect of the film to me that was the least satisfactory because I didn't really feel like, boy, I wish these guys would get together and what a shame it never happened. It just felt like it was a plot device, and maybe that's the chemistry between the actors or the lack of it, which you can't always predict until you actually put people together, not even on the room, but on film, to see how it looks. Now at another tournament, the boxing tournament at KG5, which is another school that Bruce attended, and this again is based on reality. Having done a fair amount of Wing Chun training, he did get into the ring to box and won his matches. And this is like, again, probably a romanticized or a kind of slightly exaggerated version of what really happened. But it's certainly, at this stage of the film, I think audiences who've bought a movie called, Young Bruce Lee probably want to see the young Bruce Lee do something apart from looking at girls and doing the cha-cha, and this is their moment. And again, we're kind of preempting, foreshadowing. Later he's going to be fighting Bob Baker in Fist of Fury. He's going to be fighting Chuck Norris in Way of the Dragon. The idea that Bruce Lee, the Chinese hero, is going to come into the ring and take on a much bigger opponent and come out on top because he's representing not just himself, but the courage and the skills of the Chinese people. Again, credit to Aarif for pulling this off because Bruce Lee, of course, was significantly shorter, let's say. He was obviously had a fantastic build, but he was shorter than Aarif is, and you don't really feel in the movie a time when you go, boy, why is this giant playing, somebody who was evidently a much smaller man? He really pulls it off. And Chin Gar-lok getting to come into his own here. In some ways, it's tougher to do boxing well on film than Kung Fu, because Kung Fu is stylized anyway. So when you actually start choreographing it for film, it's safer because you're saying, okay, you block, I kick, you duck, you'll clip each other occasionally. But we all know what boxing looks like. Very few people know what a real Kung Fu fight should look like. But we've all seen real boxing matches where guys really try to hit each other. So these are always quite tricky to do and to make them work. And particularly when you don't have stuntmen in the ring, and neither of these guys are stuntmen. So this is Gar-lok getting in there and showing these guys how to move. And there's a lot of fun behind-the-scenes footage. A little bit of the Ali shuffle there. It's a little bit anachronistic. Maybe he's getting it from the cha-cha. maybe Ali took it from him. But anyway, it's like you get this chance to see the two guys in action. And it's tricky because you see behind the scenes they were like really clipping each other a couple of times. It's very hard to not do that when you get in the ring and the adrenaline's going and you're in that lonely pool of light when they go action and you've just got to do your thing. What they're doing, I think, this actually is an error. They're recreating at certain points. There's a famous still or famous photograph that's in some Bruce Lee biographies that is supposedly Bruce Lee up against the ropes being hit by somebody else, and then the caption says he came back and won the fight. That's actually not Bruce Lee. That's actually another boxer who happened to be in the same boxing tournament that Bruce did, and I guess he had a vague resemblance, and whoever was researching that book mistook it for Bruce and put it in there. But there's a couple of shots here which are very much like that. Kind of like this combination of shots here. It's very much like that black and white image come to life, where Bruce is on the receiving end. And you kind of like... Bruce's thing was, whatever he lacked in raw power and height and reach, he made up for in speed. And not necessarily just the speed of punching, though that's very important, but the reaction time, the reaction to somebody trying to hit him. And that was something that they referenced earlier, even before he knew how to box. When the other guy was coming at him, like before he got distracted, you could see that he had a sense of distance, like just how far he needed to be away to avoid being hit. And that's what Ali had. And I think for a fighter, obviously, if you can keep hitting the other guy, you can win. And if you can avoid being hit, then you can probably hit the other guy more. So this is something that you see here, that speed of Bruce Lee, that kind of cat reflex. And all the people I know who really knew Bruce Lee in his prime have all one word: this is speed, fast. He was so fast that they'd never seen anybody as quick as him. And there's the old story that when he was doing films, he actually had to slow down his movement because he was so fast that the camera couldn't follow him. I'm not sure how true that is, but you hear that enough times and you think there may be something to it. And I got to work with Donnie Yen, who I think is, in his prime, has been close to where Bruce Lee was in speed, so I can feel how that might be the case. This thing really, I think, feels like Chingalok has been curtailed for the whole of the film because there's not really been any action, even though he's the action director of credit. There hasn't been any fighting. There hasn't been much even training. There's that little montage. And now finally he cuts loose and he's like, okay, I'm going to, pull out all my tricks. I worked with him on Dragon Squad. He was the action director on that, and he's terrific. It was funny, he was doing his action choreography by day, and then he has a goofy game show on TV by night. It's extraordinary, the double lives that people have. I mean, Aarif, the guy we're seeing fighting here, he's actually a singer as well as an actor, and quite acclaimed for that. But hasn't really come into his own yet in the A-list. Maybe this is going to be his year. I hope so. I met him briefly at the awards, and seemed like a really nice guy. Feet on the earth, very very together. So we need some new leading guys of his age. So I hope he's going to be one of them. Kind of reminds me a bit of Yip Man 2, Wing Chun versus boxing. Of course, in reality, if you're allowed to kick, it's over right away, but they're not allowed to kick. He's stepping into his Wing Chun stance. And this is what they said happened, that Bruce Lee came in, he basically unleashed the chain punches, and boxers were not used to being punched in that way, and so that he could win the fights. So this is this defeat of his opponent, and Bruce Lee realized as a hero of the Chinese people. So this is kind of like the preview of Fist of Fury, or at least the Fist of Fury premiere. And I think, you probably had to have been Chinese and been a Hong Kong person and lived through what Bruce had lived through to have developed that sense of... there's a resentment, I think, that Chinese were second class in their own territory, and he kind of certainly stopped that dead in its tracks, didn't he? If anybody knows about a Chinese person, they know about Bruce Lee, and they know he's a hero who could kick anybody's butt. So now we resolve the love story, and he gets his Dear John letter. And you think, well, what if, you could have been Mrs. Bruce, you could have been Mrs. Bruce Lee. And then even when he came to America, he had a Japanese girlfriend, Amy Sanbo, ironically enough, seeing as he spent some parts of his career fighting Japanese people. But then he settled with Linda, and I think they were a great union, very happy. And sadly, Brandon left us much too soon, but Shannon's carried on the tradition. I don't always agree with the way the estate conducts business, but at least there is somebody out there perpetuating the legacy of Bruce Lee. But I look at this and I think that the intention of it and the quality that they put into the production from this side of the family is, so well intentioned and so accomplished. I'm surprised that the estate can't do something of a similar level. But the TV series, which they did in China, which was sanctioned by the estate, I was very disappointed with. I didn't think that worked at all. And so they may yet do it. I mean, I think there's many stories yet to be told about Bruce Lee. And this film pretty much sold around the world. I mean, our company bought it. It was bought in America by the Weinstein Company. And just on the name and the value of Bruce Lee, that if you have a film that you can say this is about Bruce Lee, you got that shorthand with the whole world, because everybody knows Bruce Lee and everybody loves Bruce Lee. So it certainly proved this. Again, back to the land of CG. There's no lie, I'm not a big fan of CGI, but I get the fact that you have to recreate. And I don't think it would have been such big news, by the way. That is completely fiction. The idea that they would be putting that on the front page of the newspaper or the back page of the newspaper. Another bad Western actor spouting bad dialogue. And usually it's me. Okay, usually it's me, the bad Western actor spouting bad dialogue. And even for my own films, I want to find good people. And there are good people around. I just don't think they bother looking for them. All these movies, Yip Man was like that. This one is like that. Chinese actors are all terrifically cast. There's, you never see a bad one. And then the Westerners, there's nobody that you can imagine is in an American film or a British movie or TV series. They all look like guys they dragged in off the streets of Guangzhou, which is what they did. So, kvetch, kvetch, kvetch. But that's how I feel, anyway. And that's actually a real Hong Kong shot, kind of enhanced a bit. Now we're into complete fiction. But 1 hour and 40 minutes into the film, we finally get the real Bruce Lee in this sequence. And I think it's cool the way they set it up and the way that they reference. Almost like I assume many of you who are watching this are fans of Bruce Lee, or at least aware of his films. I think the Bruce Lee fan audience is deep rather than wide. There's a lot of people who've seen a Bruce Lee movie, but there's a relatively few who are like the diehard Bruce fans. But I'm sure you're aware of his films. I always felt it was almost like a Game of Death feel. Game of Death was the last great incomplete film of Bruce, uncompleted by him. It was kind of finished after his death. But that was similar in structure. The locale was like that, this kind of like a floor of a tower, it feels like, with the wooden ceilings and everything. It's very much... And there's the cat, this is the Colosseum, where actually Way of the Dragon, referencing Way of the Dragon, where he fights Chuck Norris in the Colosseum in Rome, where each man gives the other one time to warm up before they fight. And that was the cat watching, which is something Bruce pretty much improvised when they were shooting. The scenes that were meant to be at the Colosseum were actually shot at a recreation of the Colosseum on a soundstage at Golden Harvest Studios. But they just brought in the theatre cat and put the cat in the background. I wasn't never quite sure what it meant, but it worked, like a lot of things do in cinema. The Man Sao asking hand of Wing Chun, and Owen is obviously coming in with boxing. But this is absolutely the thing with the cat is a kind of preempting Way of the Dragon, which would make sense because, I mean, he directed and completely created Way of the Dragon, so he could put in whatever he wanted. So here you see the kind of the stop hit of it's kind of Wing Chun. I mean, there's a little bit of anachronism here because you do get a little bit more of the Jeet Kune Do than there would have been at this stage in his development as a martial artist. But he's basically doing these kind of just this technology, for a little bit of exaggeration there, for Hong Kong style stunts. But this technology of like just in Pak Sao and straight blast, at the time, if you were a European, if you were a Western boxer, you'd never seen anything like it. And to a certain extent, they still have not. People still have not. But it's like he would be applying these kung fu techniques in this kind of setting and using just the trap, the idea of almost like this blast where you just, rather than going side to side, you're just coming forward along the straight line. Wing Chun's all about the center line between yourself and the opponent and controlling that center line. So this is Bruce Fist of Fury when he's beating up on the Japanese master, when he's fighting Chuck Norris at the end. There's kind of a little bit of this MMA throwing and stuff, which is anachronistic. I mean, the grappling stuff. This end of Fist of Fury, you get to see a bit of that. But this slamming around, I guess people could have been doing that to each other. It feels a bit Ultimate Fighting for me. They would pretty much be trying to stay on the ground. If they fell down at this stage, they would get up And if it was a sportsman-like competition, there's a Wing Chun kick, side kick there, low side kick. Okay, those are kind of the Wing Chun style of kicking. There's a couple of kicks you saw him do earlier in training, which felt like the more chambered ones. When he left for America, Bruce wasn't doing those kicks. It was really his exposure to Jun Rhee, Chuck Norris, and the other guys who were doing the Koreans kicking that changed his view on leg techniques quite a bit. But this low-line stuff is much more in the keeping with Wing Chun. If you look at the Yip Man films, Donnie very rarely kicks above the waist, if even there. That's not what the style is about. By the way, it's a bit of a reach that this guy, as well as being Bruce's boxing nemesis, is also the son of the police captain. That's another Where the Dragon moment, the shaking of the head and the look at it. I think it's to come in and play it straight and do Bruce and then bam into the side kick there. Could have been better extension on the side kick, but you feel that. And this is another bit. By this stage, you're like, okay, we need a little bit of a Hollywood ending. So set the guy on fire. This, I'm sure, even Robert would admit, did not happen. And if it did, then no one talked about it. But it was, I think that they've correctly gauged the audience that this stage of the proceedings, they want things to be amped up to another level. I like the fact they made an attempt to give the relationship between Bruce and his opponent some depth here. Probably physically, he really came into his own. But I think you could have had you could probably had a better actor if you'd cast the net a little wider. But it works, and I think that's probably one of the most effective scenes in the film, and probably the scene that sold the movie internationally was people seeing that. And I think there may have been an anticipation that the whole movie was going to be like that. But from my conversations with Manfred Wong, the producer and co-director, he was pretty upfront. He said, no, this is a historical drama showing you how Bruce Lee was. By the way, I should mention the music that was accompanying the fight was the Way of the Dragon music by Joseph Koo, which is like the classic score, and they actually got the rights from him to use the music, which is good. Now you see Aarif doing a Bruce Lee English accent. It's good, not as good as mine, man. I got a bit of a cold today, but when I talk like Bruce Lee, it sounds like the man. He did a good job, but I mean, I'm the guy that dubbed Bruce Lee for Game of Death, so I mean, that's going to be on my gravestone. Here lies the guy that dubbed Bruce Lee. Now this, leading up, this is kind of like, when I watched the movie for the first time, I thought that was kind of the end, that he fights the guy and he goes to America. But suddenly the film takes a little detour into Johnny Toe territory, and you're here in this kind of the wastelands, and he's out to rescue his buddy, who is going to be, who's a drug addict who's fallen in with the wrong crowd. And the other thing is, I figured, okay, they're going to take this a step further, and you're going to see Bruce Lee in the real world being a kung fu hero. But in fact, having just seen him have the big one-on-one fight, when he gets into this scenario, he's completely out of his depth. So it's a further twist on what your expectations for what a Bruce Lee movie is going to be about. This is an amazing set. Partly it's an actual location outside Guangzhou, and partly it's on the studio itself. And this actually is an exaggerated depiction of a real serious problem that Hong Kong had at the time, which was opium addiction, drug addiction of various kinds. It's still an issue today, but not like then. And opium, of course, damn us Brits, had been introduced by the British because it kind of kept the natives in line. And so, hence the Opium Wars, and we have a lot to answer for. I guess I've made up for it for myself in terms of the amount of energy I've expended spreading the good word about the value of Chinese culture. Maybe my karmic weight is a little less, but certainly the British colonial government has a lot to answer for. And by the way, I just want to stress that all of this final act, all that we're seeing here, including this character, the drug addict, it's all completely fictional as far as I know. I've never heard reference to this. There's I guess you're kind of elaborating and exaggerating on the fact that Bruce Lee had clashes with gangs in Hong Kong and had to leave to go back to America. So you can read into that what you will. But this whole scenario, and as I say, it really feels, this is where, even though it's still lovingly shot, it moves dramatically into territory that's much more like an Andrew Lau, like Young and Dangerous movie, Guat Jai, like a Lau Wai Kong movie, or a Johnny Toe, very much a Johnny Toe film. But you get to see Aarif cut loose as an actor, which is good, because he kind of moves away from the Bruce Lee impersonation, because we never really saw Bruce Lee in real life exhibiting this kind of emotion. And rarely in the films either. I mean, it was a very stylized kind of fury. He didn't have many realistic emotional encounters in the films. So this is a different aspect of him. So this was completely made up, and they really wanted, I think, to show the humanity of Bruce Lee and also to give a big set-piece finale to the movie, because it just, I guess, you felt like if you end with a duel, it's too much like you're trying to recreate the structure of a kung fu movie, and this evidently was never going to be that. People always ask me about Bruce Lee, where's the next Bruce Lee coming from? And I always say we had the next Bruce Lee, but he wasn't doing kung fu in a yellow tracksuit. He was a guitar player or he was a painter. He was somebody who transcended the rules creatively, as Bruce Lee did. Bruce Lee says, absorb what is useful, reject what is useless, and create what is specifically your own. That was his thing. And we've had that from many other people, filmmakers, musicians, artists, in the time since Bruce Lee. And I think, in a way, those people are his kind of disciples as much as the guys doing Jeet Kune Do or wearing yellow tracksuits in China. It's Hanjin's moment here. Hanjin's drama. He's decent as a supporting actor. I hope he does more of this, because obviously music is his main thing. But this is his chance to come onto the camera. Also a big Bruce Lee fan, as are we all. And there's Brother Hong laying down the law. He really looks like a gang boss of that era. And there was this uneasy truce at the time between the British colonial police, who were incredibly corrupt, and the gangs, who were very powerful. So here we are on this. This is all the scaffolding. This is very much something that you could have found at the time, because in this era, Hong Kong was enjoying enormous industrial growth, expansion of building, and reclamation of property from the sea. And so there was a lot of this happening, and certainly a location. I don't believe this ever happened to Bruce Lee on a location like this, but certainly that there would have been locations like this at the time that he would have been familiar with. But the fighting here, very different to the stylized kung fu, different to the one-on-one fight, as this kind of desperate running street fighting style. As I say, much more like something you'd see in an Andrew Lau movie and a Johnny To film than you'd see in like a Jackie Chan film normally. But Garlock getting good value out of his stunt team. You've got terrific stuntmen in Guangzhou. I've used them at our studio in Nanhai a bunch of times, and they're as good as anybody in the business. So that's who Jim Garlock was using for this. And of course it's fantastically cheaper to build somewhere like this and to stage an action sequence like this if you shoot in China, even compared to Hong Kong or even Thailand these days. So anybody watching this who wants to do their movie, come to China, because I think you can build anything, and it's going to be vastly cheaper than doing it elsewhere. There's good stunting. This kind of reminds me a little bit, more than a Bruce Lee thing. It's kind of where Jackie Chan would have the finale. And if you look at a film he did, Project A Part 2, Egaiwa Number 2, there was a sequence very similar to this at the end, where they were clambering over bamboo and going in different directions. And I think that these are actual buildings that have been bambooed up. They're actually, part of them is buildings that exist in Guangzhou, and some of them are buildings that are on the back lot at the film studios. So they've kind of cut it together very well, so you get this vast expanse of this bamboo zone where these guys are like having their chase. I don't know if so many guys will be running after two fellas that came in to save their one friend, but it makes for a good finale and a little enhancement there to the backdrop. This feels more like it would be somewhere in the remote New Territories than if it was like in built up Hong Kong, if you see the woods and the misty woods in the background. But by the time you get the final reel, usually if you've done a good job, you've built some goodwill with the audience, and if you're going to get away with stuff, then now's the time. So I think that's what they're trading off on that. So you get again, wires, CGI here to keep these guys safe for the high falls and what have you. And Bruce Lee's main foe at this point being gravity. I actually was reminded a little bit from certain angles of the old Golden Harvest studios. If you see some of the roof and you see some of the stuff that was shot at Golden Harvest. Harvest actually was a textile factory before it was a film studio. So it never really looked... Shaw Brothers looked like a movie studio. And Harvest always looked like a warehouse that had been converted from other use, as in fact was the case. So this is like question... Again, Bruce Lee as a person, who is he? Is he the guy that lets go, or the guy that lets himself get hit? And he's the guy that would let himself get hit. So again, in terms of the person that Bruce Lee is becoming, who's the Bruce Lee who would be a hero, and here's the cops. I don't know, it's like, who's worse, the gangsters or the cops? In those days, pretty much the same. I mean, the ICAC came in and they cleaned it with a broom, and it's way, way better. You can't imagine how corrupt it was back in the day. There are films like The First Shot, Lee Rock. If you go back and look at some of those movies, they depict life in like the bad old days of the corrupt British colonial government. And I should say one thing that's a testament to the filmmakers. You just saw that sequence and you actually feared for Bruce Lee. But having said that, obviously he cannot be crippled or die because he grew up to become Bruce Lee. So that's actually quite hard to do, that you get somebody in the momentum of the scene. I didn't mention it while we were watching the actual sequence, but it's like if you actually watch it and you think, well, definitely he didn't break his leg, definitely he didn't die, because he grew up to be the guy that made Fist of Fury and Way of the Dragon. But the filmmakers are sufficiently savvy that they seem to put him in danger to the extent that you stop thinking that. And I think that was well done. And now flashback to this. But this is all kind of like exaggerated reality. I mean, William Randolph Hearst said, if you have a choice between the truth and the legend, you print the legend. And here, I mean, it's not quite that. Dragon, the Bruce Lee story, was printing the legend. This one is more like taking the truth and then exaggerating it through the prism of cinema. But it's a film where I think it got criticized for not being the film people expected it to be, rather than getting critiqued for being the film that it was. And I think it's great that we now have it on the label and that people can actually reappraise the movie if they have seen it before, if they haven't seen it before, and they can actually see the quality of it. And I think it's a film that just the technique with which it was made deserves to be appreciated. It's funny, I guess if it was almost like it was about somebody but Bruce Lee, it would have been an easier take for some people. But I guess the legend of Bruce Lee carries such a weight now, all these years on, that you're expecting more than could perhaps be delivered. So for the last time, you come to the family home, and this is extrapolating reality, because there is a sense that in the real world, the father ran out of track with Bruce, couldn't find a way to discipline him, couldn't find a way to curtail his adventures, and he was like, okay, so we're going to send you back to America. You're going to have to be the exile. Go away and make something of yourself. The tragedy is, of course, that Lei Hoi-chun passed away relatively young and didn't live to see Bruce's enormous success. His mother did. Grace lived to a ripe old age and got to see Bruce's his height of his success. Sadly also saw his passing, but then saw him become a legend as well. So she got to see more of the whole sweep of Bruce Lee's life. And Lei Hoi-chun really, they met again, of course, when Bruce returned to visit Hong Kong, and then Bruce returned for his funeral. But in terms of a reconciliation where Lei Hoi-chun realized that his son was going to become this extraordinary hero, didn't happen, at least not in this lifetime. So this is a really great scene for Tony Leung and for Aarif, and I can really sympathize, because I think all of us felt, I certainly felt when I left England to come to Hong Kong, that in some way I'd exiled myself. Nobody had said to me, you've got to go, but my life and activities in England made it feel like the natural thing is go to a country not your own and try to make something of yourself. And that's something I think I really related to when I was reading about Bruce Lee over the years. He's somebody who has been raised in Hong Kong, but he has to leave his own land. And even though he later becomes the idol and the icon of the Chinese people, he has to go to America and try to make it there. So it's kind of a sad ending. And it sets up a part 2 or part 3 of this. I'd be really interested. I feel that when you get into part 2 and part 3, given the material that you start covering, maybe you have to cooperate with the Bruce Lee estate in America to do that, whereas this movie was, as is stated, quite categorically at the beginning of the movie, there was no cooperation between the makers of this film and the Bruce Lee estate. Whereas they did on the TV series, the CCTV TV series, it was with the approval of the estate. So you probably have to get into that kind of ground, but there's no reason why not. And I think this film sold well internationally, and I think critically will be well received internationally. So it'd be interesting to see if they can actually go ahead. Look at Hanjin having his moment there with the wooden dummy. I've got to get me one of those. I've got nowhere to put it. So you get this kind of whole finale now where you actually resolve each one of the characters. And I guess if you do a part 2, you can actually come back and see how everybody lived their life. Now, Robert became a singer and did films came back to Golden Harvest and did a couple of films. He never really, obviously, he wasn't going to be an action star, but he was doing kind of musical comedy kind of movies, romantic comedy kind of films. Did like 3 pictures, 2 in Hong Kong, 1 in Taiwan, and 1 Golden Harvest movie, which does kind of riff a little bit on the fact that he's Bruce Lee's brother. The closing song that we hear is called "I Close My Eyes." It's performed by Ken Chan. A nice score for the film. Doesn't overly dwell on the themes from Bruce Lee's films, but it did the right moments. I thought the use of found music, the 1950s pop music, was well done, and the fact that at the right moments in the film they actually riffed on the Bruce Lee music so that it worked. It's extraordinary how these themes take on a life. On the good ship. I shouldn't sing that, we haven't got the rights. Anyway, on CGI, on the good ship CGI. God, I hate CG. But anyway, in the old days they built a boat. When we did Shanghai, the movie, we built the boat. But here it's a CGI boat. So off he goes to America. And I remember an interview with Robert where he relates the story. And he says, that the father put a few dollars in his pocket and he said, good luck, I hope you make it. I hope he makes it. And then when Bruce was going away, the father called him back, and it's like a Chinese custom that if the father does that, and we don't see the father here, but, Robert told a version of it where the father asked him to come back. Maybe it was at the house. It was like, if you ask the son to look back at you and then he walks away, it means that the son will return. And Lei Junfan, his Chinese name, means to return again, as indeed he did. Went to America, kind of fought the system in the States, further developed himself as a martial artist and as a person and as a filmmaker, and then came back to Hong Kong and became the greatest star the industry's ever had. And I think, one of the 5 greatest stars the world has ever had as a movie star. Somebody whose charisma and, like this movie comes out and you can sell the world because you're telling people we're going to give you Bruce Lee. And part of us still wants to have Bruce Lee back, all these years on. So that's why it works. So I'm looking at it again, and I really, I saw it in the theatre. I probably had some of the same feelings that critics and the audience had, which was, boy, for a Bruce Lee movie, this takes its time. It dwells on the period. It shows the influences of Bruce in great detail. And I kind of want to see him doing kung fu. And now I look at it again, I think it's a fantastic companion piece to the later Bruce Lee movies. You look at this, and if you look at the later films, you understand Bruce Lee, the man, more. Whereas before, I think we just understood Bruce Lee, the legend and the myth. But from this film, it's like, as I say, the Rosetta Stone. Look at that fantastic, fantastic location. I definitely, my award for, best location of the year would have been the Lee House from this movie. It's wonderfully recreated. It's a lot harder, I think, to recreate somewhere that has been than to create somewhere that's totally newly realized from whole cloth. Because if you create it from nothing, then you make up your own rules. If you are creating somewhere from a bygone era, then there's certain rules that you have to follow, and they do that. And here's the Way of the Dragon music, which is kind of interesting because the Chinese title of Way of the Dragon is like, the dragon crossing the sea, and that's just what's about to happen in this sequence. Now I thought this was really brilliant. They actually, throughout the end credits, they're showing on the right or below, there's the actual person, Lei Hoi Chun, or the family, and then the recreation of the same picture using the actors from the film. And it's extraordinary. Sometimes you really can't tell them apart. There's the famous dance scene. See, I remember seeing that still in a book of Bruce dancing with his brother, and that's him as a baby. And I think, I think that really, to me, the success of a film is how closely it adheres to the filmmaker's intention. And I think this film really did that. I think that this is the film that Robert wanted to make. And if you read the companion book about his memories of his brother and of his family, it's so affectionate and nostalgic. That's what he wanted the film to be, and that's what they did. And it's unfair, I think, if you judge somebody's movie because it's not the film that you would have made or the film that you thought it was going to be. Because I think filmmakers really, it's hard enough to make a film anyway. So you might as well just make the film that you really want to see and that you really think deserves to get made. And you hope afterwards people would like to see the movie, but that's all you can do. And that's what happened here. So I don't know, the next time we're going to have a Bruce Lee movie on the label, because the rights to the actual Bruce Lee movies are kind of tied up. So it's great to have that. Great ensemble cast. I mean, Man Jun is somebody who's been around the industry a while. He's had an interesting track record. I mean, he produced and wrote and put this together and got Robert to actually do it, because Robert had been talking about it for a long time. Man Jun had discovered Shu Qi, the girl who was in Transporter. You might remember her from that. And a lot of Hong Kong films. And she was actually meant to be in Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. And at the last minute, Man Jun actually pulled her out to do a tea commercial. They were like rehearsing for the film, and Ang Lee let her go, and he hired Zhang Ziyi instead. And Shu Qi's great, but that maybe wasn't the smartest day of Man Jun. But he also discovered Christy Yang, who's in this film, who's also in Storm Riders, and put this movie together. He's definitely a mainstay of the industry, involved with Storm Riders and to an extent with its sequel, Storm Warriors, which is available on Cineasia. Tony Leung, who's in this film, I should mention, is in Detective D, which is another upcoming release on the label. So this, to me, shows you the quality. We take our Hong Kong filmmakers into China, and also for me, as somebody who's based in Hong Kong and in southern China, the potential of South China as a filmmaking base. And I think this is a good example of that, because I think technically the quality of the film is beyond reproach. And that was purely shot in the south of China. I don't believe anything was shot in Beijing or Shanghai. It was all here. Fat face, they did all the CGI. I mean, you know what? For CGI, it's good CGI. I'm not a big fan of it. But what they do well. It's very hard to recreate period Hong Kong these days, so I understand why they had to do as much of it as they did. And you'll see elsewhere on the DVD, we got behind the scenes. Not much deleted scenes. They pretty much shot what you see, which is interesting. Because a lot of the times you get cool stuff, like on Yip Man 2, we have a bunch of deleted scenes, stuff that didn't make the final cut. This is an interesting companion piece to Yip Man 2 in a lot of ways. It explores some similar themes from a different angle. Like I said, Yip Man 2 is a kung fu movie with family values, and this is a family value film with some kung fu aspects. So you can actually watch them back to back. It's a good Friday night double bill. And if you have enough beer and enough pizza and enough dancing girls, I will come to your house and do a live commentary. And if second prize, I'll do it for 3 nights. So I want to thank everybody for their ongoing support for Hong Kong action filmmaking and for Cineasia label. This is Bey Logan signing off from Young Bruce Lee. Thank you. Joy Gin. Bye-bye.